Welcome to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Our host is Dave Garrison from Ohio Christian University, a longtime Fortune 100 company top executive and a former U.S. congressional candidate from Texas. Our goal for the Faith and Liberty Talk Show is to give you an opportunity to listen to interviews and discussions with significant authorities and experts on subjects related to Christians engaging in the civil and political arena. The mission of the show is to give you real information and not sound bites that you can really use. We have a website for the show, faithandliberty.org. At this website, you can obtain more information about the show, our guests, subscribe to our newsletter, and become a friend of the show, and like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page. You can also access all of our previous shows. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If our show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. Now, let's begin today's show. Thank you for joining us.
Today we have with us Dr. Stephen Meyer, somebody that I've interviewed before at the National Apologetics Conference. And Dr. Meyer is the director of the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture and a founder both of the Intelligent Design Movement and of the CSC. Dr. Meyer, thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, it's awfully nice to be with you again.
For the listeners' benefit, I'm going to discuss a little bit of your education because I think it's pertinent to the conversation that we're going to have. Dr. Meyer has a PhD and an MS in History and Philosophy of Science from Cambridge and a BS in Physics and Earth Science from Whitworth College. Dr. Meyer, there was quite a firestorm, as some people referred to it, over the Smithsonian article that was published in one of their journals, and Dr. Richard Sternberg. Would you explain what happened that caused the firestorm there, please?
Well, this was back in 2004, and I submitted an article for publication to a journal called the Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington, which was then edited by a senior scientist at the Smithsonian named Richard Sternberg, who had 2 earned PhDs in biology. He sent the article out for peer review. It came back from 4 different peer reviewers with different critique and corrections, suggested corrections. I made those suggestions, responded to the critique, resubmitted the article, and it was subsequently published. The article was addressing really mysterious topic in the history of life in evolutionary theory. It's called the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of the animal forms that first arise in the fossil record all around the world. And I argued in the article that the neo-Darwinian mechanism of natural selection and random mutation couldn't explain the origin of these animals, and instead the information, the genetic information required to produce them, I argued indicated the role of a designing intelligence in the history of life. In other words, I argued against Darwinism and for intelligent design in the article on scientific grounds.
How dare you?
Yeah, well, that was the sin. In fact, later people said if he'd just stuck to critiquing Darwinism, it would have been all right. But to propose intelligent design as an alternative was a bridge too far. The article was published in August of '04. For about a week, there was no reaction, and then suddenly the lid just came off at the Smithsonian. Sternberg was locked out of his office. His keys were taken away. He was denied access to his scientific samples. He had been previously working with a senior scientist there who was his supervisor and close colleague. He was transferred out from under the supervisorship of that senior scientist to the watchful eye of museum bureaucrats. A disinformation campaign was then waged against him. Later, a congressional committee investigating his case found that in the email trail that there was a very intentional attempt to discredit him. False rumors were spread that he was working for the Bush campaign, that he was a priest, that he had no science degrees, all kinds of things. And eventually he was demoted, and along the way they went to the National Institutes of Health, where he had a dual appointment, and tried to get him fired, and it took the intervention of a United States senator to save his job at the NIH. So it was a really nasty kind of instance of retribution, ideological retribution. One of his colleagues said, you let this guy Meyer put a cruise missile into our mosque, and that was the kind of the emotions were running extremely high at even the idea of intelligent design being broached in a scientific paper.
Well, since then, you've been on CNN, MSNBC, NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox News, PBS, and BBC. Why do all these media outlets want to talk to you? Because you're pretty frequent on there.
Well, I'm not that scintillating, I guess. But, I think the issue is extremely controversial, and I think people intuitively understand that the issue of biological origins is one of those issues upon which a whole lot of other things turn. Every worldview has to answer the question, what is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else comes? And the Darwinian answer to that question, or neo-Darwinism, the modern theory of biological evolution, has played a big part in answering that question in strictly materialistic terms. It says, the materialistic worldview, or sometimes called the naturalistic worldview, or sometimes people would refer to it as an atheistic or agnostic worldview, says that matter and energy are eternal and self-existent, and they self-organize themselves as a result of purely undirected material processes. And Darwinian evolution is the mechanism of mutation and selection, is the material process that accounts for new forms of life from arising from simpler pre-existing forms. So it's a key part in that story, the materialistic narrative about how everything got here. And as such, it underwrites this materialistic worldview. And people, I think, recognize intuitively that in our culture there is a clash of worldviews between the traditional Judeo-Christian worldview and this secular materialistic worldview, which is allegedly based on science, but of course that's a lot of what we're challenging in our work on intelligent design.
Yet these different news outlets, what are the questions that they are asking you, and why do they contact you for the interview? Just because they see a clash in worldviews? Is that all?
Well, they're not that philosophically interested that they would just call us up about the clash of worldviews. But the clash of worldviews comes into the open in our culture now and then in various kinds of ways. In 2004, it came into the open because of this Sternberg case, and there, we had NPR and the Washington Post and the New York Times and eventually Bill Riley all getting interested in this case. Sternberg was on the O'Reilly Factor discussing what had happened to him. But then in 2005, we had the Dover case over whether or not it was constitutionally permissible to discuss intelligent design in biology classes. And we've had the new atheism phenomenon in the publishing world with these books such as Richard Dawkins's The God Delusion. And this week we've had 3 members of Congress put forward a resolution to lionize Darwin and declare February 12th Darwin Day, and also in their declaration essentially attempt to settle the scientific debate about Darwinian evolution by telling the country that it's a compelling explanation, a logical explanation for the origin and diversity of life, and that the science of genetics overwhelmingly supports it. So you have people, sometimes they're commenting on the issue of biological origin, sometimes the things that bubble up into the culture are derivative of one's view of biological origins, and at that point the media often takes an interest.
Well, Ben Stein did the movie that I mentioned before, and that's Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And my assessment of the movie is that what happened with you and Sternberg were a big reason that the movie was put together. What is Ben Stein's premise in that movie that got you involved?
Well, he had an interesting super trailer that they did for the movie even before they produced it, which I thought was extremely insightful. I have the trailer on my website, darwinsdoubt.com. There's a YouTube channel on the website, but in it, he looked at the Sternberg case, and the case was in fact what piqued his interest in this topic, because it was just so extreme. And to the ordinary person who regards scientists as figures of respect and as people who are known for their objectivity, who are willing to weigh the evidence and consider competing hypotheses and ideas, this reaction of mainstream evolutionary biologists at the Smithsonian was really hard to fathom. What is so heinous about this idea of intelligent design that you can't even have a civil discussion or a scientific discussion about its merits? Which was, by the way, Sternberg's motivation at the time in allowing the paper to go through the peer review process. He had seen a lot of discussion of the idea in the media and in school board hearings, and he thought it was time to allow a scientific discussion of the idea to go forward. In any case, Ben Stein was just kind of taken aback by this seemingly irrational response of these mainstream scientists right in the heart of the scientific establishment, and so he became intrigued and found that there were many other cases of academic censorship taking place within the scientific world precisely around this issue. So he did a whole film about it. But you asked about his premise, and in the trailer to the movie, he said in his famous deadpan way of speaking, he said, "In my experience," he said, "this is not the way people who are confident in their intellectual position behave." And so, and I think that intrigued him. You know, these guys are the guys with all the authority. They represent the consensus in science, but they're responding in a very emotive and reactionary way, a kind of emotional way that didn't seem consistent with the scientific enterprise.
Well, there's an old saying, I'm an attorney from Texas, although I've had real jobs all my life, and there's a saying we use down there that actually I think originally came from Senator Sam Ervin during the Watergate trial, where he said, if the facts are against you, argue the evidence. If the evidence is against you, argue the facts. If they're both against you, raise Cain and confuse everyone.
Yeah, right.
And
right.
That's what, struck me when watching that movie. And academic censure goes on all over the place, and people don't realize how prevalent it is. But aren't there organizations that are dedicated to fighting against intelligent design out there?
Oh, well, I call them our alphabet soup of opponents. You have the mainstream media, which for the most part was reflexively hostile to us when they started to cover the issue. But then you have the National Center for Science Education and the People for the American Way and the ACLU. All these groups think it is their constitutional duty to keep people from discussing this issue. And their logic runs something like this. The Constitution bans an establishment of religion. Creationism is a form of religion. Intelligent design is a form of creationism. Questioning Darwin on scientific grounds is a form of intelligent design. So even if you have a textbook raising scientific challenges to Darwinism, questions that you would find in this peer-reviewed scientific literature, that constitutes, in their view, an establishment of religion, and therefore you have to shut down the discussion entirely. And it's obviously there's some gaps in the logic there, but they're trading on equivocal definitions. But that's the thinking.
Many in the scientific community, we'll call them, refer to science as factual, whereas creationism or intelligent design is usually discussed as based on faith. How do you react to those statements?
Well, the theory of intelligent design is an evidence-based interpretation. It is based on evidence. It's based on a standard method of scientific reasoning. It does have larger worldview implications. No one is denying that. But so does Darwinism. Darwinism is also an inference from biological evidence, and it also has larger worldview implications. Implications, as I mentioned before, support a broadly materialistic worldview. So there's an equivalence between these two different theories. They're not two different types of things, one science and the other religion. They are both, I think, historical scientific theories about what happened in the past, what caused life to arise, and they both also have larger worldview implications. But what's happened is that one of those theories, Darwinism, has been defined as a scientific theory, and intelligent design has been treated as if it were religion, and therefore one of them is thought to be something that can be discussed openly and in the public arena. The other is something that is deemed something we need to censor.
Well, that brings me to the question, how do you describe yourself? Do you describe yourself as a creationist, an advocate of intelligent design, a Christian? How do those terms strike you?
Well, I'm a proponent of intelligent design, and I also happen to be a Bible-believing Christian. But not all proponents of intelligent design are Christians, and one of the reasons for that is you don't actually have to be a Christian to see the evidence for design. It's quite compelling, irrespective of what your worldview is, and it's compelling because of the nature of the evidence.
We'll return with our guest, Dr. Stephen Myers, in a few moments after some messages from our sponsors.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Dr. Ben Carson and Dr. John Maxwell are coming to Ohio Christian University Monday, April 21st at 6 p.m. Get your tickets today at ohiochristian.edu for this riveting event featuring Dr. Ben Carson and Dr. John Maxwell. Tickets are going quickly, so secure yours now at ohiochristian.edu to meet Dr. Ben Carson and Dr. John Maxwell at Ohio Christian University on Monday, April 21st at 6 p.m. Made possible by Millwood Inc., the Computer Workshop, and Christian Healthcare Ministries.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
We return now with our guest, Dr. Stephen Myers. Let's get right to the heart of a matter where, and I'm not going to get into the Bill Nye, Ken Ham debate right at the moment, but Bill Nye did mention a couple of times when questions were posed to him, we don't know. And if you hear Richard Dawkins, he'll say, we don't know. And to me, this is the heart of the question. How would the evolutionary process develop complex life, in their view?
Well, this is what my view, this is what my book, Darwin's Doubt, is all about. It's about the origin of the first complex forms of animal life that arise in the fossil record. And they do so in geologically speaking, very abruptly, very suddenly, in the same layers of rock all around the world. And this has posed a huge mystery for evolutionary biologists back to Darwin's time. And Darwin himself acknowledged this problem. The standard Darwinian or evolutionary explanation is that a mechanism known as natural selection acting on, now we would say, random mutations. Darwin didn't know about mutations, but we do today, is the mechanism, the cause for the production of new forms of complex life. The problem with that, or there are many problems with that, and I go into them in the book, Darwin's Doubt, but the biggest problem has to do with something that's been discovered in 20th century biology during the last half of the 20th century, starting in the 1950s with people like Watson and Crick. Biologists came to realize that information in the form of digital code stored in the DNA molecule is crucial to building new forms of life. I used to ask my students a question: if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would immediately know and answer code or software or a program. And the same thing turns out to be true in life. If you want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form, or if you want to get life in the first place from simpler pre-existing chemicals, you have to have instructions on the DNA molecule for building all the proteins and protein machines that are necessary to maintain living cells. And so the explosion of all that animal form we see in the Cambrian period is not just an explosion of form, of structure. It's an explosion of information. And relying on copying errors in DNA to produce all that information is really an implausible way of generating new code. If you take a section of DNA or a section of computer code and start randomly changing zeros and ones, ask yourself a question: are you more likely to degrade that code or generate a new operating system or computer program? Obviously, it's the former, and the same kind of consideration applies when we're talking about the digital information in DNA. Mutations degrade information long before they ever generate new proteins or genes.
Well, you give an example in your book, Darwin's Doubt, I believe that's where it is, about the Rosetta Stone and intelligent design. Can you describe that analogy
Well, right,
to
that's
us?
a way of getting at the question of what is the positive case for intelligent design. And I should mention that the critiques of the neo-Darwinian mechanism, in particular, scientific criticism of the mechanism showing that it lacks the creative power that is that we long thought it had, but which it would be necessary to generate these Cambrian animals, are legion. There's all kinds of reasons to doubt that the mutation selection mechanism has the creative power to generate the form and information necessary to explain these fundamentally new forms of life that arise in the history of life. But that's on the critical side. What is the positive case for intelligent design? Well, the positive case is actually based on our uniform and repeated experience of what we know about what it takes to generate information. Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever devised. And what we know from experience is that it takes a programmer to generate information. And in fact, what we know generally is that when you find information, especially if it's in a digital or typographic form, and you trace it back to its source, whether it's in a computer program or a paragraph in a book or a hieroglyphic inscription, such as on the Rosetta Stone, you always come back to a mind, not a material process. And so the discovery of information at the foundation of life is a powerful indicator, I argue, for the activity of a prior designing intelligence. The explosion of information that would have been necessary to generate all those Cambrian animals, which is the subject of my new book, is also powerful evidence of a designing intelligence, of intelligent design. And so I use the Rosetta Stone as an illustration to awaken our intuitions about what we know about the causes of information. When you see that artifact in the British Museum, you don't say, hey, isn't it wonderful what wind and erosion did? Instead, you know, because of our uniform and repeated experience of what it takes to produce information, that there was a scribe behind that, a mind behind the inscriptions on that stone.
And I think the other example that's well used and well known is the watchmaker's one. Would you explain that one too? Because I think it's similar, because I'd like the listeners to be aware of that.
Well, this was an argument that was made by the British theologian and sometimes he was a practitioner of natural theology named William Paley, and he said if you find a watch in a heath and you pick it up, you know immediately that it was designed by a watchmaker. And then he argued that by analogy, the living systems are far more complicated and intricate than watches. Therefore, they must have had a watchmaker as well. They must have had an intelligent source. Now, Paley made his argument before Darwin, and when Darwin came along, he said, well, actually, in the words of Richard Dawkins, there's a blind watchmaker. The process of natural selection and random mutation, or random variation, is the way Darwin put it in his time, could produce the appearance of design, the appearance of intricate parts being put together. And so he got rid of the watchmaker argument by saying there's an undirected natural mechanism that mimics the powers of a designing intelligence, which is not itself designed or directed in any way. And this is why, in the present, the question of information is so critical. because while there are things that the mutation selection mechanism can explain, mainly small-scale variation like finch beaks getting bigger or smaller in response to changing weather patterns in the Galapagos, information does not appear to be one of those things that the mutation selection mechanism can explain, and yet it is a striking appearance of design, one for which there is not an undirected process readily available as an explanation. So I think we're back to the pre-Darwinian times, though I think the argument has grown more refined and sophisticated than it was in Paley's time with his analogy between a watch and an organism. What we now have is not an analogy. What we now have is an identical effect, an identical feature present that is present both in systems that are known to be designed by human agents and in life, and that is information. So we're not just analogizing complexity, saying, well, life is similarly complex to a watch. Instead, now we can see that life and things that we know are produced by human agents, intelligent agents, have the exact same feature present, and that is information, digital code.
We'll return with our guest, Dr. Stephen Myers, in a few moments after some messages from our sponsors.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Dr. Ben Carson and Dr. John Maxwell are coming to Ohio Christian University Monday, April 21st at 6 p.m. Get your tickets today at ohiochristian.edu for this riveting event featuring Dr. Ben Carson and Dr. John Maxwell. Tickets are going quickly, so secure yours now at ohiochristian.edu to meet Dr. Ben Carson and Dr. John Maxwell at Ohio Christian University on Monday, April 21st at 6 p.m. Made possible by Millwood Inc., the Computer Workshop, and Christian Healthcare Ministries.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
We return now with our guest, Dr. Stephen Myers. In the Darwin or the evolutionist or the neo-Darwin or whatever term you want to use, they believe that life sprung from inorganic materials, right?
Well, this is there are two branches of evolutionary theory, and it's important to clarify that. There's biological evolution, which attempts to explain new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms, and there's chemical evolutionary theory, which attempts to explain the origin of the first life from simpler pre-existing chemicals.
Good.
And as it happens, I've written two books, one about each of those subjects.
That's why I'm bringing it up.
The first book, well, thank you. The first book, Signature in the Cell, was about chemical evolution and the origin of the first life. And so, and the second book is about biological evolution, and the relevant theory there is as you said, neo-Darwinism, the modern form of Darwin's theory. But the relevant evolutionary theory when we're talking about the origin of life is called chemical evolutionary theory, or sometimes called evolutionary abiogenesis, life from non-life. In Signature in the Cell, I argue that chemical evolutionary theory has reached a state of impasse, and it has done so precisely because it cannot explain the information in DNA that's necessary to produce the first living cell. And instead, that information, I argue, again, based on our uniform and repeated experience of what it takes to generate information, points decisively to a designing intelligence. So the origin of the first life is a huge problem. And since you have watched the Expelled film, you'll remember the interview at the very end with Ben Stein and Richard Dawkins.
Oh yeah, that's why I'm bringing it up.
Stein, being nobody's fool, and knowing the questions to ask, pressed Dawkins on this, and Dawkins did acknowledge that. Quote, no one knows how life first arose. At least I would qualify that from an evolutionary point of view.
But what theory did he propose?
Well, he, unfortunately for Professor Dawkins, he kind of went off on a speculative extravaganza and suggested that maybe, in fact, there is a signature inside life. And I, of course, I was watching the film in the theater in 2008 when he said this, and I was still working on Signature in the Cell, and he used a phrase that was almost identical to the title I had chosen for my book. But he said, maybe there is a signature inside DNA, but he said that then if so, that life could have been designed by an intelligent agent, but that intelligent agent would have had to have evolved someplace else in the cosmos. And so, Ben Stein raised his eyebrow and said, so basically he's talking about an alien or something,
Right.
Later, Ben called that the ABG hypothesis, anything but God. So,
yeah, right. But I don't think a lot of people are aware, and if they haven't seen that movie, that there are a lot of these people who do not believe in intelligent design that actually think that that's a viable option, that aliens came and seeded life here on this planet.
Well, there are a few people, but prominent people, who have proposed it. Francis Crick proposed it in a book in 1980 called Life Itself, and he got so much pushback from his fellow scientists that said that there were so many conditions that had to be just right for life to arise on Earth that it was essentially a miracle. And so at that point, he said he wouldn't talk about the subject anymore. And Fred Hoyle, a very prominent British astrophysicist, had a version of this hypothesis as well. It's called panspermia, is the technical term for it. But it's mainly illustrative of just how difficult the origin of life problem is from the standpoint of strict chemical evolution. The basic problem is that chemistry, the chemicals that are relevant to living systems, don't interact with each other the way they would need to form the kinds of molecules that we actually see in living systems. So chemistry doesn't behave itself. It doesn't do what it needs to do to allow life to arise spontaneously because of chemical interactions. And it certainly doesn't produce information-rich molecules, a point that I make in Signature in the Cell. So it's a really vexing problem from the standpoint of standard evolutionary theory.
And I do, at this point, want to really recommend both your books, Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell. Although there's some pretty complex technical information, you have a really great way of making it plainly understood. And I think that's especially a talent that you've been given or possess.
Oh, well, thank you. I had the benefit of teaching freshmen in college for 12 years, so I learned to use visual aids, perform gags, and stand on my head to get ideas across. And when I set out to writing Signature in the Cell after many years of wanting to do so and planning it and having it delayed by many other responsibilities, one of my colleagues, Nancy Piercy, who is quite a good explainer of ideas herself, said, well, what you need to do is write the books the way you teach. Tell a story, and so that's kind of what I tried to follow her advice. I don't know how successfully, but that's what I tried to do.
Well, you close your ears for just a minute, Dr. Meyer, because I'm going to say something to the listeners here. I rarely ever ask for autographs. I'm not really very impressed by celebrities and personalities. But I went and bought your book, brought it to the first interview we did, and had you autograph it. And partly because I think over time, you are going to be one of the people that history is going to say he knew, he tried to tell people, and they weren't listening. And I appreciate all the work that you're doing. So now let's go on to something that Ben Stein sarcastically says that he muses to himself, I guess, as he's coming to your office, and says something like, well, maybe the reason Dr. Meyer is doing this is because it's going to make him rich. So putting forth these arguments and causing all the controversy. How's that working out for you so far?
Well, then he also went on to make fun of our dinky little office, So I don't know. Once we get rich, we'll get a bigger office. Let's just say that.
We'll return with our guest, Dr. Stephen Myers, in a few moments after some messages from our sponsors.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Dr. Ben Carson and Dr. John Maxwell are coming to Ohio Christian University Monday, April 21st at 6 p.m. Get your tickets today at ohiochristian.edu for this riveting event featuring Dr. Ben Carson and Dr. John Maxwell. Tickets are going quickly, so secure yours now at ohiochristian.edu to meet Dr. Ben Carson and Dr. John Maxwell at Ohio Christian University on Monday, April 21st at 6 p.m. Made possible by Millwood Inc., the Computer Workshop, and Christian Healthcare Ministries.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
We return now with our guest, Dr. Stephen Myers. Let's kind of move in another direction, and I'm going to read a quote by Thomas Jefferson that I really like. If a book be false in its facts, disprove them. If false in its reasoning, refute it. But for God's sake, let us freely hear both sides if we choose. And that's coming from a man in the Enlightenment, and he wants to hear both sides. Do you believe that the theory of evolution and intelligent design should be included in the science curriculum of public schools and universities, and why?
I don't think there's any constitutional reason that we shouldn't have both the modern neo-Darwinian theory and the theory of intelligent design taught or discussed. You can teach about a theory without endorsing a theory. I think that's something that confuses the public. But as a practical matter right now, we have been recommending a different policy at the secondary level. The Dover case in 2005 was just an absolute debacle. It was poorly framed. The people pushing intelligent design had also made very explicit statements of religious purpose in their school board meeting. And when the judge struck down their very otherwise modest proposal to inform students of a book in the library discussing intelligent design as unconstitutional, it threw the whole status of intelligent design as a permissible idea into uncertainty. The judge's ruling only officially applies for a judicial district in central Pennsylvania, so it has not been ruled unconstitutional, and it was very much at a lower court level. So the status of the theory as something that can be discussed in the public schools remains to be clarified. The problem that we have with pushing intelligent design into the schools at this point is that we want to win the argument in the spirit of Thomas Jefferson at the highest levels of academia and at the highest levels of science. We were very heartened this fall when my book, Darwin's Doubt, received a critical review in the journal Science, and the scientist who reviewed it, Charles Marshall, one of the leading evolutionary biologists and paleontologists in the world, attempted to refute the information argument, the argument from the explosion of information in the Cambrian period that I make in support of intelligent design. I think, and my colleagues think, that Marshall failed to refute it, that he actually begged the question as to earlier unexplained sources of information. But that is the kind of debate that we want to have right now. And what happens when we get the folks pushing intelligent design into the schools now is it results in court cases that ends up stigmatizing and marginalizing our scientists and drawing them into legal proceedings that are premature. So as a matter of principle, I think there should be no reason that both theories shouldn't be or couldn't be taught. As a matter of prudence right now, it's premature to push it. What we are recommending instead is that and this is important, to blunt the kind of ideological indoctrination that many parents and students experience in biology classes, is that school boards and states adopt policies that encourage teachers to teach the strengths and weaknesses of Darwinian theory, that they allow teachers to present criticisms of the theory as they appear in the scientific literature, and such criticisms are, as I mentioned before, legion. There is absolutely no reason, if Darwinism is a scientific theory, that the criticism of the theory cannot also be taught. That's a matter of simple scientific literacy. If you're going to teach Darwinian evolution, students should also know about the criticism of the theory so that they get a full picture of the actual status of the theory. And so that's where we are in the education policy right now, and I think that's probably the most prudent course of action.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed, and I'd be curious if you've noticed the same thing, the big public universities, they talk about being so unbiased and impartial. Yet, when I ended up becoming the dean at Ohio Christian University, I noticed throughout our courses, throughout our classes, no matter what the subject is, we end up talking about two sides to almost every argument. Yet, all the college, big universities, we'll have students come here, and ones that I've known, courses that I've sat through not that long ago, believe it or not, you'd only hear one side of the argument. So my assessment is that in a lot of the faith-based colleges, they have more discussion about both sides in the spirit of the Thomas Jefferson article or quote than you find at the big major universities, because of the, I guess as Ben Stein said, it's closed to anyone who challenges its theories or paradigms are excommunicated. And it's not just in this area. It's also in free markets, the rule of law, all sorts of subjects. Don't you agree?
I do, and I think it is ironic, but the dynamic is also somewhat easy to explain, because the people at the small religious colleges and universities are well aware that their viewpoint is the minority view within their disciplines. But yet many of them at those colleges, and oddly not all, but many of them hold that minority worldview, and that affects the way they teach their different disciplines. But they also know that there is another side, whereas the dominant secular research universities are now so dominated by people who hold a default secular or materialistic worldview that they're hardly aware that there is another point of view, and therefore there's no point in engaging it. Or alternatively, they are aware of another point of view, but they have classified it as religious and classified their own view as scientific, and think that they only need to deal with scientific ideas, and therefore they can exclude the contrary interpretation of the evidence that may be relevant in their field, whether it's about biological origins or whether it's about the nature of human nature. In the social sciences are rife with these same types of controversies. Social scientists are quite comfortable talking about genes and environment as the materialistic determinants of behavior, but they also leave out another possibility, that humans are free moral agents who are capable of making choices that are not completely determined by genes and environment. And so the materialistic assumption about human nature is deemed to be scientific, whereas bringing in a fuller conception of personhood, which is more consistent with a Judeo-Christian understanding of human nature, is deemed to be religious and not scientific. And again, it's just not engaged. So I think that dynamic you're talking about is very real, and I think it does impoverish the educational experience of a huge number of students, because the clash of worldviews is real, and there are different ways of interpreting the evidence depending on the worldview you hold, and that ought to be part of a good academic conversation in the true spirit of Jeffersonian pluralism.
Well, that actually brings me to a conversation about worldviews. And for the listeners' benefit, what I mean when I'm talking about worldviews, it's where you're coming from as you start looking into some matter, issue, or subject. Everybody has some sort of worldview. And one of the things I talk with students a lot about, and I'm sure you have over the years, is what we call confirmation bias. So your worldview colors everything that you're looking at. So you're only looking for that information or that theory or that philosophy that agrees with your worldview. What makes these worldviews so difficult in this arena that you're involved in?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I have a definition of worldview that I'd like to offer.
Yeah, please do.
It's a personal philosophy. It's a lens through which we interpret reality, and and what worldviews do is they offer a set of more or less coherent answers to the big questions, the big philosophical questions about the nature. First of all, the question about what is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else came. The questions about human nature, not questions about what the stock market's going to do tomorrow or who's going to win the World Series or the formula for salt, but these deeper underlying questions that are that help us make sense of everything else. And the reason that the discussion of biological and cosmological origins is so fraught with contention and controversy is precisely that it is a question upon which whole worldviews turn. The answer to the question is essentially the answer to a worldview question. So these are scientific questions, but they're questions with incorrigibly philosophical implications. That you can't get rid of these implications, and so people sense that, and they sometimes respond emotionally. So it's really one of the challenges of having a good discussion in this area, productive discussion, is to make sure that you're not bringing your own worldview, a premise from your own worldview, into the argument. The old saw is that that many Christians will argue for the reliability of the Bible on the basis of the Bible saying so. Why is the Bible reliable? Because the Bible says so.
Yeah, circular.
But other people can do that as well. And one of the things that got my colleague Philip Johnson into this debate, the famous law professor from University of California, Berkeley, who wrote Darwin on Trial back in 1991, is that he realized that many of the advocates of evolutionary theory were arguing in a similarly question-begging way. They started out by defining science as a purely materialistic enterprise, such that if you're going to be a scientist, you have to answer every question by reference to purely material processes. Then, having defined science that way, they look at the question of biological origins, and they give a materialistic answer because that's the only answer they think they are allowed to give. And Darwinism, being the most plausible of the materialistic explanations for the origin of new forms of life, wins by default. But that's really the essential question is being begged, which is a materialistic explanation the best explanation for the origin of life and the new forms of life as we see them? Or might there be a role? Might there have been a role for a designing intelligence or a mind or a creator of some kind? That option is ruled out of court by the very definition of science, and thus you have these kind of impoverished conversations where really you have the sound of one hand clapping. There's only one side being represented in the discussion.
Right. Well, one of my other favorite quotations, boy, you've gotten me to do all sorts of quotations today with this subject. It's great.
You've got to send me the Jefferson one. That's terrific.
It's actually included in a little booklet in the jacket of the Expelled No Intelligence Allowed movie. So people, you can go out and buy that too.
Well, we have that. I'll have to look for it. Thank you.
But this other quote that I like is Aristotle, and I've taught this to my 13-year-old grandson, and actually I've put a wallpaper up on my computer with this. It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. And what that quote is getting at is an educated person who really cares about inquiry and critical thinking ought to be able to entertain an alternate view without reacting in this repressive way. And that's the thing that really caught my attention and why I wanted to talk to you, back in October and now again today, because I think this repression is getting worse. And, a lot of people on the political side feel that there's less and less religious liberty and less freedom and what have you. But do you think it's increasing, or are we getting better at debating these things in the open?
Well, I do think it's increasing in the academic world and in the media as well. That's interesting. The quote from Aristotle is interesting. We used to talk about the broad-minded person, a person who could understand another person's point of view without necessarily having to, accept it or endorse it. And it's crucial to the process of intellectual deliberation to be able to weigh the strengths and weaknesses of competing ideas. In fact, science itself advances. There's a great Italian philosopher of science named Marcello Pera, who says that science advances as scientists argue about how to interpret the evidence. And that deliberative process requires dialectical freedom. You've got to be able to weigh the arguments on both sides. You've got to be able to critique arguments. You've got to be able to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of competing ideas to get to what might be the best explanation of the evidence at hand. So that's crucial to science. The problem we have in the culture at large is that in an increasing number of people in an ideologically sensitized culture equate science with some consensus view of some scientific topic. So Darwinian evolution is not so much viewed as a scientific theory, it's viewed as what science says. So that if you question Darwinian evolution, you're not just questioning that theory within science, you're questioning science itself. You're deemed to be anti-scientific.
And their whole worldview you're questioning.
Yeah, well, and it's a misunderstanding of what science is. Science isn't the consensus view of a topic dropped down to us from on high. It is instead a process of inquiry that allows us to weigh competing interpretations of the evidence. And the other place where this is happening very frequently is in the debate about climate change, or I like to state the hypothesis much more precisely, the debate about human-caused global warming. And this same resolution that the Congress, 3 members of Congress have put forward to lionize Darwin and to tell us all that debate has been settled, also says in their resolution that science must be protected from people who question the effects of human-produced greenhouse gases on the atmosphere and on our climate. Well, science doesn't need to be protected from skepticism. Science needs skeptical opinions it needs people to have the freedom to express skeptical opinions. So there's a profound misunderstanding as to what science really is. It's not baptizing a particular consensus view of any particular subject. Rather, it's a process of inquiry that allows open evaluation of competing ideas.
Well, I want to show this again in another small way, maybe. To some people it's a small way. But talk about what happened the day of, I think it was Darwin's Doubt was released, and what happened with the reviews in Amazon.
Oh, my, yeah. Well, by 3 o'clock in the morning, the book was released and first available for purchase at midnight, the 18th of June. And by 3 o'clock in the morning, there were already 1-star reviews being posted on the Amazon site. And on the next day, the 19th, there was a 9,400-word review posted on the Amazon site and then on the blog Panda's Thumb, which is a popular blog for proponents of evolutionary theory and neo-Darwinian evolution. And the review was written by a then grad student at Berkeley, he's since gotten his PhD, named Nick Matsky. And then that review was cited as the definitive reason for rejecting the book by Jerry Coyne, a leading evolutionary biology professor at the University of Chicago. It was cited by the reviewer of the book who wrote in The New Yorker, by a reviewer who wrote at National Review, even a reviewer recently who wrote at the religious journal First Things, have all cited this review. So it sort of, the criticisms that were written apparently at great speed were recycled by others, and the main point is that people were lying in wait for this book, and And I have to tell you that I find all of this attention rather flattering because it really shows that the other side viewed the arguments that I was going to make and now have made as profoundly threatening to their position. You don't react that way to a book that has no import. So I'm not really at all upset about this. I'm really rather delighted at the extreme nature of the reaction because I think it betrays more about the weakness and lack of confidence in the position in those who hold the opposite position than it does say anything about the book itself.
Well, I have brought this up to the listeners before, but I'm going to bring it up in a different context. When I was at the dreaded Halliburton Company, I had 4,500 people in 56 countries.
You are a bad person.
Yeah, I can really pick places, I guess, or I can't hold a job or something. But in any event, I would visit, these various countries and various offices, and I would find that political correctness, the kind that we practice here in America, is blasted by most educated people in other countries outside of Muslim-dominated countries. And that's something I see. I don't know how much international experience you've had, but would you agree with me that this phenomenon is worse here in the United States?
I think it's bad in the Anglo-American world. It was not as bad in Britain when I was doing my PhD in the 80s, but increasingly I think Britain is succumbing to a lot of the same types of ideological pressures and agendas. I think continental Europe, oddly, though it's much more secular, a lot of continental European scholars and scientists with whom we've had a fair amount of interaction find the American impulse towards political correctness kind of odious and distasteful, at least. And we've had a number of conferences with European scientists, by the way, there's a huge amount of international interest in the challenge to Darwinian orthodoxy, and a fair amount of interest in our alternative of a theory of intelligent design. We found that there are some very good British scientists who have organized themselves into a group called the Center for Intelligent Design, a number of full professors of science within the British system. The Brits don't call everyone professor. You have to get to the top of the field before you get that designation. And a number of very prominent European scientists who are known skeptics about the standard evolutionary orthodoxy. So very often the media presents the theory of intelligent design as an American phenomenon confined to the American Bible Belt or something, but in fact it's gone international. And we have a journal that's now 4 years on since inception called Biocomplexity, which is a technical, peer-reviewed biology journal looking at the issues in the Darwinism design debate from a technical scientific standpoint. And the editorial board for that journal is just very impressive, with scientists from many countries, many of whom are representatives of their own respective national academies of science in their countries. So this is a topic of worldwide international interest, and I don't think it's going away. I think there was an attempt back in 2005 with the Dover trial to put intelligent design out of business in the courts before it got out of hand. I think it's gotten out of hand, and I think it's great.
I know we're probably both short of time here, but I wanted to see if you had some overall comments about the famous debate that occurred recently with Ken Ham and Bill Nye. Did you see it?
I did see it, and I've obviously been asked to comment on it a lot. The debate focused mainly on the question of the age of the Earth, and those of us in the intelligent design research community are really focusing on a different question. We think it's a more profitable question to focus on. It's certainly more consequential to our scientific understanding of how life arose and to the larger worldview issues that are in play, and that's the question of design. The biologists want to say, the evolutionary biologists, the Darwinian biologists want to say, as Richard Dawkins has said, that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And the key word for them is appearance or illusion. Life looks designed, but it wasn't really designed because of purely undirected, unguided process produced everything we see. Because Dawkins is so convinced of that there is no real design, and because he acknowledges the design argument was always the strongest reason to believe in God, he actually makes his Darwinian biology the basis of his new atheism and says that the denial of design by Darwinian theory has made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, and he now goes further and says that essentially because there's no public scientific evidence for design and therefore a designer, there can be no public evidence for belief in God, and therefore belief in God is, as he put it, tantamount to a delusion. That's his title, The God Delusion. On the other side, I think what we are saying is that the evidence for intelligent design is that for a real designer is not just the appearance of design, but for real design is very powerful and can be demonstrated scientifically, and therefore there is evidence that has broader theistic implications that supports a theistic worldview. And I would say in combination with some other evidence, like evidence from cosmology, I think you can actually make a good case for the existence of God from science. And so I think that's the big issue. If Phil Johnson put it this way, is God real or imaginary? And I think that's the big issue of our time. And I thought that the Ham-Nye debate was focused on a minor issue, and we've tried to refocus it on the debate about biological origins on the more central issue.
Well, Dr. Meyer, I thank you so much for your time. It's been very educational and illuminating, and I think you've done an excellent job in both the books that we mentioned before, Darwin's Doubt and Signature of the Cell, and I appreciate what you're out there fighting and doing. And of course, my confirmation bias is towards intelligent design, so I enjoyed this conversation very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and thanks for such a good and wide-ranging conversation. We really covered the waters.
On behalf of our host, Dave Garrison, I'd like to thank you for listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show today. For additional information about the show, please go to faithandliberty.org, where you can access previous shows, like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page, and access other resources. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If the show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. The opinions and comments represent the views of our speakers and may or may not represent the views of Ohio Christian University. May God bless you, and thank you for listening to our show.